Hi, I'm Joel Oppenheimer, and we're in the East Wing of our Chicago gallery that specializes in antique natural history art. Today we're going to share with you a few items from our collection that we're featuring this week, and we're going to begin by talking about a couple of beautiful Audubon prints, original hand-colored engravings by John James Audubon that were created in the early part of the 19th century. We have here a wonderful example, unframed, of the blue crane or heron. I'm going to hold it up for you. Now, this is something you shouldn't necessarily try at home because a piece of paper has to be handled in a very specific manner so that it's not damaged. You have to allow the weight of the paper to assume its own position. The blue crane is a great example of how Audubon worked collaboratively with other artists. Audubon is most often referred to as a self-taught artist, but he brought with him a great knowledge of how artists worked in a European manner and incorporated oftentimes in a workshop style the efforts of other artists as well. In this case, Audubon was the author of the primary subject, the bird, and in virtually all of the pictures that he created, that is the case. This image was created in the 1830s originally, when he was on a trip down the Florida coast, actually beginning in the Carolinas, and he worked his way down through Georgia and to Florida. And there's a wonderful background here that complements the picture. It's a view near Charleston. It also shows a 19th century rural landscape. So it's reflective in that aspect of the period in which Audubon lived. This background was not painted by Audubon. It was painted by a young Swiss artist that worked with him for a few years in the 1830s by the name of George Lehmann. Now, Audubon was a very accomplished artist, and he could paint pictures of people and of backgrounds. And he was also very capable in representing the botanical elements. But his real forte, his genius, lied in his ability to portray birds. And he wisely incorporated Lehmann's talents for the background in this work. You can see this is one of the best examples of the detailed landscape. Now, since this print is unframed, we have an opportunity to show you the watermark in the paper that Audubon used. We're often asked about authenticating Audubon prints, and if you have a good knowledge of his work, there are a number of ways that you can tell that the print is original. But the one way to establish authenticity that anybody can do is to determine if the paper has the J. Whatman watermark. And this is the name of the paper maker that created all of the paper for Audubon's work. There has never been an original Havell or first edition Audubon print made on paper that did not have a Whatman watermark, and there has never been a forgery or modern print made on paper that has a Whatman watermark. So it is a definitive way to establish authenticity if you can access the sheet of paper and shine a light through it, which we're going to do now. The reason that a watermark is absolute in terms of establishing authenticity is that the watermark is actually created as a part of the paper-making process. So it's integrated into the original sheet of paper, cannot be added afterward. The way a watermark is made is it's part of the screening process, and I'll briefly describe what it is because it'll make it easier when you're viewing it to understand what you're seeing. The Audubon prints were made on what's called a wove paper. So it's a continuous sheet of paper without laid-in chain marks that one may be familiar with from looking at a fine piece of stationery. So the paper is slurry, the pulp that becomes the paper is laid across a fine screen in a mold. And on that screen, there are wires that are laid into it that become the design of the watermark. And these wires, because they're raised, displace a certain amount of the paper pulp. And when the sheet is formed and dried, there is a thinner area in the paper that is not visible unless you shine a light through it. So backlighting is the method that is used for viewing a watermark. If we were in our conservation lab, we'd place this paper on a light table and you'd easily be able to see the watermark. But in this case, in situ in the gallery, I'm simply going to take the flashlight on my phone and I'm going to hold the paper up and I'm going to slowly reveal the watermark. In this case, the watermark is upside down because they didn't really pay attention to the orientation of the watermark when the paper was being printed in the press. So I'm going to, here is the J. Wattman name in the paper, and below it you have the actual date that the paper was made, 1836. Now, the print itself has a date printed on it that's a part of the engraving. You won't be able to see it because it's very fine, but in the bottom right corner of the image, it says that it was engraved and printed by R. Havell in 1836. Today we're going to talk briefly about Audubon's magnificent portrayal of the Trumpeter Swan. Audubon procured most of the subjects, the birds, that he painted himself. And he observed them in the wild extensively and wrote about them extensively as well. However, the Trumpeter Swan is a rare example of a bird that he did not procure himself, although he had seen it years earlier on his expedition in Florida, along the Florida coast. He had been given access to a U.S. cutter ship by the United States government for the purpose of this expedition. So by that time, Audubon was well known enough that he could command that kind of cooperation and service from the United States government to further his work. There was a captain of the ship that had remembered Audubon had failed to capture a Trumpeter Swan, and years later had sent him as a gift 2 specimens from which he worked to create this picture. In front of us, we have an exact replica of Audubon's original painting from the collection in the New York Historical Society. And you can see the subject is almost identical to that in his hand-colored engraving. However, parts of it are unfinished. So this is a great example, again, of Audubon's collaborative work. But in this case, the background and parts of the foreground and the water were completed by the engraver, Robert Havell, and Havell Jr. in London as the prints were being produced. You can see that the water is not there, and the moth that the Trumpeter Swan is bending its head back to capture is not present in the original watercolor either. If you look closely at the watercolor, you can see some pencil markings and lines that Audubon placed as an indication to the engraver as to exactly how he wanted it completed. But Havell produced the finished product in this case. This is one of my favorite Audubon compositions. Now, Audubon is largely regarded as a self-taught artist. However, he is also credited by many as being America's first great watercolorist. And this is an example, in terms of composition and draftsmanship, of why he deserves that title. If one looks at earlier works that were created, we happen to have an example of an 18th century engraving of American birds by Mark Catesby. And as wonderful as this image is, you can see that there's a flat, sort of stilted 18th century quality to the composition. Audubon transcended that in creating a three-dimensional, articulated composition that much more resembles a 20th century sensibility. And it's for that reason that he is so highly regarded as America's first great watercolorist. This is also a wonderful example of Havell's use of the aquatint technique, where he created the transparency in the water. And you can see the underbody of the bird, the illusion of it appearing through the surface of the water. Another aspect of Audubon's genius, his particular genius and his ability to portray birds, is the lifelike quality. He is often credited with anthropomorphizing his subjects, but in actuality, he wasn't lending human characteristics to the birds. He was bringing them to life as the creature it was. And he had the ability to synthesize his vast knowledge and observation of the subjects from the time that he spent in the field observing the birds' activity and their behavior, and then through his artistic ability was able to translate that to the paper. This is also a magnificent example of that ability as the bird comes to life and is viewing its subject. It's in the intensity of the view of the eye on the moth, and you can only anticipate what is about to happen next. This particular print is a virtually perfect example in terms of the condition and quality of an Audubon engraving. It's hard to believe that it's actually nearly 180 years old. The paper is untrimmed, the very full margins, the ink is crisp, there are no stains, the original watercolor is, every stroke still remains. We're going to see two early 17th century engravings today by Basilius Besler. The lineage of natural history art can be traced back to Greek civilization. However, for thousands of years, pictures of plants were depicted primarily for utilitarian purposes to illustrate herbal manuals, because it was known early on of the medicinal properties of plants and herbs. It was Basilius Besler's work in 1613 that first depicted natural history as works of art. Besler came from the tradition of being an apothecary, and his interest in the flowers did stem from the medicinal and utilitarian aspect, but he envisioned portraying the beauty of each flower as it bloomed. In all, there were 4 different editions of Besler's work that were produced, and even the most recent one was only made in 1713, the early 18th century. The 2 examples that we have here are from the 2 first editions that were created, both at the same time period in 1613. This is an example of what we refer to as the Deluxe Edition, extraordinarily rare print. There were only 25 sets of these prints produced in 1613. At the same time, he was also producing what is referred to as the regular first edition. The same engraved plates were used. However, this is made on a different paper, and it is identifiable in part because of the text that is on the back of each sheet, which shows slightly through the paper. This is a beautiful example of 5 different tulips. These are hand-colored engravings. Interestingly, Besler himself was not the artist, and in viewing natural history art, the various editions and pictures came to be for different reasons and in different ways. When we talk about John James Audubon, for instance, he was the explorer, he was the ornithologist, he was the artist, and he was the publisher of his work. In many instances, there were artists who were in fact not the individuals that created the images. They were, in a sense, the producers and the directors of the work. And that is the case with Besler. There were 13 different artists and engravers that worked for many years to produce the entirety of his work. You can see the difference between the Deluxe Edition and the first edition. If you look very closely, they're both very high quality rag paper that the engravings are executed on. But the Deluxe Edition is a more refined fiber. It's a smoother sheet and it's a whiter paper. It was also produced without the text on the verso of the sheet. And it is believed that these 25 sets were the sets that he had intended to have colored and presented to the aristocracy and royalty of the time that would have been the customers for these pieces. Although Besler employed the talents of numerous artists, viewing these 2 prints side by side is an example of how he was in control of the project and the primary aesthetic behind it. When you view these 2 pictures, they appear as though they came from the same hand. So it's important to recognize the influence and the authorship of these works as belonging to Besler, and that's why they're referred to as Besler's, and he's considered to be the creator of the work. When one walks through our gallery, they're viewing the history of natural history art in terms of many different aspects. When one first comes in and they see two pictures of flowers, for instance. This is an engraving by Pierre-Joseph Reduté that was produced in 1807. And again, this is by Basilius Besler, produced in 1613. One might think, well, they're both botanicals. But in fact, as you educate your eye, you begin to see that there are tremendous differences in the aesthetic of these pieces, but also the technology of printmaking changed as well. And you see the history, the evolution of printmaking technique. The Beslers are among the earliest, and these are German works, linear engravings. So the engraving is all just done by incising lines into the plate. And they're very bold and very much reflective of the Germanic aesthetic of the time. This is nearly 200 years later, the early 19th century, and it's French. And you can see that there's a softer, more refined quality to the aesthetic of the picture. However, also, the technique had changed. They're still in copper plate engravings in that there are areas that are subtracted from the copper that receive the ink that then creates the image when the paper is pressed upon it. But there is not a single line in this entire engraving, whereas the Beslers relied entirely on line engraving. By now, there had been a new technique called stipple engraving that had been invented, and it was more of a pointillist method of creating the image. And they were able to create more subtlety in the transition of color from the printing. Continuing with the theme of viewing the works within the period that they were made, and how this influenced the technique and the aesthetic, bridging the gap between the 17th century German work and the 19th century French work. We have the 18th century first published natural history work from the New World. We have two examples of Mark Catesby's etchings from a 1754 edition. This is the red-bellied woodpecker and the hairy woodpecker. And when he made these paintings and brought them back to England, created the etchings and sold these works, it's the first time that Europeans had seen these subjects from the New World. Here's another example. The Parrot of Paradise, as he called it. This bird came from the Cuban part of his expedition. It's not seen anywhere today in North America. Catesby's also self-taught as an artist. He really considered himself a naturalist, but he taught himself to draw and paint. And although he was funded for his expedition, when it came to producing the works, he had run short of money and couldn't hire an engraver to translate his paintings. So he taught himself the skill of etching and produced the actual copper plates for the printing himself. Consequently, they have a slightly primitive quality. Aside from the period in which they were made, it was also his self-taught aspect that lent itself to a slightly more primitive rendition, which is a great part of the appeal to many people today in collecting his work. So it has the historical aspect, it has the aesthetic aspect, and it has the rarity, all of which contribute to the collectability of the work. Thank you for joining us today and allowing us to share our collection with you, a small part of it. And if you enjoyed the experience, please click the like button at the bottom of your screen. See you next time.